not have an English interpretation of the song. It's taught to us as a Delaware Healing Blessing song, and that's how we use it. And we often close our meetings with that song. And because it's a healing blessing song, I always invite people to think of someone that you know needs blessing or healing. Again, because it was sung, I already sang it twice, okay? So I'll do it 2 more times, but be thinking of that person, and especially in honor of our speaker this morning in Afghanistan and the healing and blessing that he's happening there. I'm thinking of that.
Thank you. Okay, so when we were designing this conference, we really wanted to be sure that we didn't live in a realm of abstract idealism, but really wanted to emphasize practical solutions that are happening now. And these 3 folks up here are each, in their own way, doing something really practical in terms of peace building. So Solange Muller will speak first. I'm going to read her bio. Okay. Solange Muller, MPH, Master in Public Health, is a nutritionist at Hudson River Healthcare. She is a longtime advocate for immigrants' rights to health care in her work as a public health nutritionist, and she worked with immigrant women in Dutchess County, New York. Prior to her work in the community health movement, she did public health and human rights work in Central America for over 10 years. Solange has 40 years of experience in the public health field, internationally and locally. Her concern for justice and human rights for the marginalized has been a guiding light throughout her life. She is on the board of Voices, a small NGO that works in promoting sustainable and equitable development in El Salvador. She managed the aid program in Colomancagua camps for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees before she became a protection officer her last year of service. I imagine that was a little dangerous. She is a member of the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, and is very active with social justice and pastoral care locally. In the 1980s, she worked at the Friends Peace Center and at Friends World College in San Jose, Costa Rica. She is a spiritual director through the Shalem Institute in Washington, D.C., and works primarily with immigrants and the incarcerated in this ministry. Her father was Robert Muller, an international civil servant with the UN for 40 years, who became the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. He focused his energies on nurturing a better world, including working for the environment, economics, and peace. He was instrumental in the conception of many multilateral bodies, including the UN Development Program, the World Food Program, the UN Population Fund, and the World Youth Assembly. So Solange will speak first, then Jeffrey, then Masooma. That will help out with the discussion. There'll be some time for Q&A after that.
was really moving for me to hear the witness of working in the Afghani refugee camps, because it's my work with the Salvadoran refugees that really transformed my life. But before I begin speaking about that witness, I'm here today because my father, Robert Muller, was in World War II and was in the French resistance. He was imprisoned several times, and he escaped being recruited by the Nazis. And because he survived and decided to devote his life to peace and work at the United Nations for 40 years, and then 20 years at the University for Peace, I have been given this gift of life because he survived, and the gift of also working for peace, but in a different way, really with the marginalized. My father met Keith Smiley, so I'm going to read something that he wrote to Keith. To my dear Keith Smiley, hoping that your new conference center will become a high point for the preparation of the year 2000. Most warmly yours, in peace, Robert Muller. Sandra handed me this morning, and I'm sure my father never believed that when he wrote those words to Keith that I would be standing here today, and that I would be here really today because of Sandra. So it's really a gift of the miracles that come into our lives that we are all gathered here today, and I have this opportunity to speak. So I'd like to start with a moment of silence, and I will speak out of that silence as Quakers tend to do. On November 16th, 1989, 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter were brutally murdered in San Salvador, El Salvador. Their assassination came at a time after that country had already been through 10 years of a brutal civil war that cost 75,000 lives and led to over 10,000 people being in exile in the neighboring country of Honduras. It was their death that eventually led international pressure to start the peace process and call for a ceasefire, which led to the peace accords that were signed in January of 1992. Padre Segundo Montes regularly visited the refugee camps of Colomoncagua in Honduras, close to the border with El Salvador, where I worked many years before he actually started visiting the camps. He visited regularly in 1989 to have conversations with them on the return to their homeland, because he felt that their return would be a way to bring peace to that country. And so he went regularly and spoke with them about the return. He was so impressed with the communal way of life that they had developed during their 9 years of exile, a communal life that was built because the camp was surrounded by the military, but yet they somehow created a new society. And he wanted them to return to their homeland, which was always their dream, and to bring the skills and the knowledge they had gained while living in exile back to their homeland. I stopped there in August of 1989 on my way home from Costa Rica to the United States because my mother had Alzheimer's and I wanted to go be with her. And my son Roberto was with me. He was 3 years old. We met Segundo Montes and heard him say Mass to the thousands gathered in the refugee camps. They loved this man, and he loved them. And he was assassinated at a time where they were preparing to return. So he never witnessed their dream of their return to their homeland. But after his death, they said, we're leaving, we're going back. And on November 19th, 2 days after the assassination, without the approval of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, without the approval of the Salvadoran government, they started to go back. And the first group that returned after 9 years in exile in Honduras walked. The people in the town of Colomoncagua, who had been their neighbors for 9 years, were told, close your shutters, close your doors, don't come out in the streets, because these people are subversives. They're dangerous. But one window was opened, and one of the Honduran men pulled out his fiddle and played a song to accompany them on their departure from the community where they had lived for 9 years. Voices on the Border started 32 years ago, accompanying the Salvadoran people while they were still refugees in Colomoncagua, because there were a lot of violations of human rights, because surrounding the camps were the Honduran military. That was my job when I was there in 1983, to protect the 6,500 refugees from the military who would go into the camps and search their humble abodes that they had constructed. So I was already gone, but Voices on the Border was there to denounce the human rights violations that occurred by the Honduran military. They terrorized the refugees as if living through a war wasn't enough terror. Voices said, one of the members of our board, Betsy Shepard, said, our presence expressed our concern to the government of El Salvador for the safe return, and our assistance served to guarantee that the communities would be able to develop in peace. So in 1989, Voices on the Border, the group that I work with as a board member, accompanied the refugees, and Betsy was on 7 of those 15 trips. Repatriation of 8,500 Salvadoran refugees who had lived in Honduras was complete in February of 1990. When they returned, they brought the refugee camp back. The boards, the nails, the roofs, the sewing machines, and all the equipment and skills of cooperative living. The new community right across the border was called Ciudad Segundo Montes. The return was an opportunity to contribute to the process for peace in their homeland, and the former refugees applied the skills and the social organization developed in the camps to create a self-sufficient model for peaceful community development. Quote, we have learned how to give work to everyone and how to eliminate the misery which caused the war in El Salvador. In this way, we prepared ourselves for the realization of our highest dream, to one day return in peace to our homes in El Salvador. And that they did. During a delegation to El Salvador in 2017, the message was clear about our little organization that has 2 staff working in El Salvador and 8 committed board members working in the United States. Voices is regarded with love and respect by the people because we are known to be a faithful presence, both during the difficult times of suffering as refugees in Honduras and in the ongoing struggle to realize their hopes and dreams and rebuild their lives. Today, Voices continues our accompaniment, which started in the camps in Honduras, in the 2 communities where the refugees resettled. One is in the Bajo Lempa of Usulutan, and the other, of course, is in Ciudad Segunda Montes, named after fallen priest Segunda Montes. Our work primarily is with education, youth, and women. In a community called La Tirana of 22 families, in 2014, the youth could no longer walk in safety the 1.5 hours to get to the school to complete 7th grade. So the community board came to Voices and said, would you help us and pay for a teacher's salary? And we did. And the Ministry of Education certified these students so that they could complete 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. In November of 2017, I was there to see the graduation of these 12 students who, because of the violence and the gang violence, had to stop going to school, but because of the accompaniment in our work, were able to finish 9th grade. A lot of our work is in education. We support the salary of a special education teacher in the community of Amando Lopez. We help with the transportation of students from 3-4 rural communities so that they can get to the primary school in Amando Lopez. And this year in July, the community of Octavio Ortiz was declared free of illiteracy thanks to the efforts of the students who worked with the elders who had been in the war and who did not have a chance to learn to read and write. These communities are often named after the fallen martyrs, the fallen assassinated priests during the Civil War. The leader of Amando Lopez said to me on a visit, I cannot forget that this community was founded because many people fought to have this land. We want to work for the good of the community, and we cannot ever forget our own history. Her own mother, Doña Lencha, had worked in our nutrition centers in the refugee camps and had lost her husband and all her sons in the Civil War. Voices also supports what are called infant wellness centers in 3 communities that serve 125 children ages 3 to 6. Most of the families cannot afford the $2 a month contribution for their children to attend these centers, so Voices helps in that way. In 2016, the minimum wage in a rural community for agricultural work was $3.94 a day. How could they afford $2 a month to send their infants to these wellness centers? How can they afford to stay in their own country and not migrate to the United States? Visiting the infant wellness centers brought back memories of my work as a nutritionist in the refugee camps. The children in our nutrition centers were malnourished due to the scarcity of food in the areas of conflict. What a gift to meet them again as healthy adults, working as teachers in the schools, in the nutrition centers, and as community leaders of the IDESCO. What a gift to be able to return and see the children as adults, because they touched my life so deeply when I worked with them in the camps. And that was a circle of love that came around and came back to me as a gift. And to walk around the villages, and my son went with me one year, he's here, and my name in the camps was Soledad, and this one girl, she was a little girl in the camps, and she, Soledad, is that you? Is that you? I guess I look a little bit the same. And it was so moving that I was remembered, not for my work as a protection officer, but because I was there accompanying them in their times of hardship and stood with them in their hope and their faith that someday they would return home, and that I actually would return and see them in their homeland after working with them when they were in exile. How much time? Almost. So my heartfelt connection to these communities born 38 years ago in the refugee camps has only grown as I have been called to witness and accompany the Salvadoran people through my work with Voices. These communities persevere in their struggle that began when they were forced to become refugees in December of 1980. To build a new, more just world out of the old with very few material resources, but with limitless faith, determination, and love, I experience again and again when I am in their company. And every year I go back, and on the 14th of November, I will be going back for the 30th year anniversary of their return. It is my work in El Salvador and my work with Voices that led me to become a Quaker. I realized in 2016, after a visit, that violence was never a path to peace. And even though I lived through a war and felt the bombings of the 500-pound bombs as they hit the villages of El Salvador, a few miles away from where I worked, I said I could never again support a revolution or as a way to peace. So upon my return, I wrote a letter seeking membership in the Society of Friends. And as Louisa shared, we have these testimonies. I feel in the heart of my hearts that I was a friend during the time that I worked with the refugees, and that they taught me how faith, hope, love, and patience can help us persevere. And it's in the silence of a meeting for worship, or in the silence that I may sit in meditation, that I hear the sound of the calling to be a witness, to immerse oneself in the lives of others, to stand with them, to see their humanity, to love them, and to be loved by them. Thank you.
Can you also get the PowerPoint ready?
A little while ago, when I was sitting in a coffee shop in Beacon, New York with Solange, chatting about this conference, I mentioned something about the flow of immigrants from El Salvador seeking asylum in this country. And she said that the folks from those towns that she mentioned weren't coming here because in her work and the work of her groups, they help people figure out not just how to survive, but how to get along with each other and how to build cooperative communities.
Yes, thank you, Solange. And now it's my heart's delight to introduce Jeffry Weisberg, and as I do so, Hart Phoenix, who's sitting right there, and Jeffry Weisberg and myself have worked as a triangle in the field of peacebuilding for about 15 years now. And this is a quote that is from our brochure, the River Phoenix Center for Peacebuilding in Gainesville, Florida. But I have to say, Hart, this is your quote. We believe that communities will benefit from an entity whose primary function is to focalize, coordinate, and champion the implementation of resources relevant to peacebuilding and sustainability. That's been happening now for 7 years on the ground. And in fact, the River Phoenix Center was recently featured on The Redemption Project by Van Jones on CNN. So it's just a joy, Jeffry Weisberg, to introduce you and welcome you here as co-founder and executive director of the River Phoenix Center for Peacebuilding, an innovative nonprofit that has created a comprehensive community model using best and next practices. And these are best and next practices of peacebuilding in both the US and internationally. Jeffry has been an instructor with Outward Bound. He's been a state mediator for over 25 years. His work as a facilitator is renowned at this point. He's excellent. And his global work with Community Solutions, which is funded by the US State Department, took him to Uganda for a solutions summit, and most recently with Heart to Bosnia-Herzegovina to facilitate a conference there for peacebuilding leaders in the region. So the River Phoenix Center for Peacebuilding, under Jeffry's guidance as executive director, offers a signature program, the Police Youth Dialogue, and I trust that will be of mention, if not now, in the breakout. And it just, again, gives me great joy to welcome you to Mohonk.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. If you were in my house, we'd play a game, after lunch especially. Play is one of those tools that we use a lot just to help kind of people feel more comfortable and de-escalate sometimes the situation. But it's also a community builder. So yeah, I'm really excited and so honored to be here in the Smiley House. This is a legacy that has been going on now for so long, and to contribute to it feels like a great honor. So let's see if I can figure this one out. Yeah, so peace is possible. How many of you believe that? Raise your hand. Peace is possible. Yeah. We might not be here if we didn't think that it was possible. I do believe that there are certain people and certain circumstances where it's a lot more difficult or not possible. But by and large, I really do believe that it is. And the story this morning touched me a lot around Eric and his son. It was Eric, right? Do I have his name right? And his son saying, love and compassion or something like that. It turns out with his mother, I believe, which is maybe even more of a feat at times. And yet I was thinking about a lot of the people that I work with in our community who have tremendous hardships and trauma and great challenges to overcome. And what I really do believe from witnessing is that even though Eric's family and his son, probably got that passed down, that it can skip a generation. There is wounding and heartache and hardship, but what I'm seeing with a lot of the young people that we're working with is that, in fact, that they are capable, even if their family and their lineage and their history may not have exemplified that. So I really believe that it's so important to have a vision of what it is that we want to create in the world. And we've taken many moments of silence, but for you just to ponder in your own mind, what is it that we're going towards? What do we want to create? And there's a body of work called the Empowerment Dynamic that really is solution-oriented. And I love the phrase solutionaries, of going for what we want, not what we don't want. And so it's important for us to really start with that. Just have a really short little piece. Hopefully the sound is on. So that was one of our first little videos, just to try to capture a little of the image of really what we're trying to do and create. And so it's so wonderful, this theme, Philip, that you were talking about this, and this is mentioned several times, this interconnection, the interconnectedness of all of life. And in our work at the River Phoenix Center for Peacebuilding, it really does start from this, that Hart's work as an environmental activist and social justice and animal rights activist, as well as my own deep, deep love of nature, is really informed by this idea that at any point, if we pull or pluck or cut any one of those threads, that it has that ripple effect. And so in the work of peacebuilding, how can we really expand this understanding of people? And I think you may have even said this, Phil, I don't know, but our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circles of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. And I often say the prayer that when I'm doing this kind of work, that if there's any benefit, may it be a blessing to all beings for all time. And that's part of what helps me to do this work. So this idea of impact, right? Everything that we do can or does have an impact on other people, on the environment, and yet a lot of times people just aren't aware, they don't consider these consequences or the impact. So this model is really important for us to consider how it ripples out into the world and into the universe. And so we use the socio-ecological model as one of our tools to kind of help people understand that we could, in fact, enter through peacebuilding in any one of these different areas, But fundamentally, we really have to start with ourselves. And so several of our wonderful speakers have spoken to maybe a personal practice and mindfulness. But we use this in our restorative justice practice for young people and adults who may have done something that interrupted, their community or their family, to consider the impact and how that ripples out into the world. And the iceberg is a metaphor that we use about who we are. That you can see I'm wearing a gray sweater and black pants, but the vast majority of who I am, you don't know. Same with everyone in this room. We make judgments just on the very little bit that's visible on the top. And in fact, it's about approximately 15% of an iceberg is visible. That makes 85% not seen, often not known. And so in our work, how are we bringing awareness and resources to all different stakeholders in our communities to consider what is driving behavior? And that Marshall Rosenberg often says that unmet needs drive behavior. And if we were able to identify some of those needs in different life experiences and provide more helpful, effective strategies of getting those needs met, that we really do believe we could interrupt the cycle of violence. And I love that you brought this up also. I think this is such an important concept for us as peace builders and peacemakers. And negative peace is essentially the cessation of violence. And I love that you added in this idea of fear as well. But positive peace is, I'm imagining all the kinds of different work that we're doing in this room and in our communities. How do we lift people into their highest potential? Looking at systems, looking at families, looking at resources that may exist, may not exist, and what can we do to bring those to bear to solve some of the different challenges that we may face. So at RPCP, we feel like our wheelhouse are these 4 different pillars. Social emotional learning, restorative justice and restorative practices, trauma-informed care, and the use of dialogues. And it was really important to us when we started 7 or 8 years ago that we didn't go too wide. There's homelessness and mental health and so many other things. But what we found is when we can focus on these different areas that we can really make a difference. And so this is what we're really trying to accomplish up here through our work, is really addressing racial, social, environmental justice, embed these into systems so that we could leverage the people doing the work, because we're a very small organization, develop skilled and aware citizens, and of course, bring resources and support. And many of you may have seen this image before. The equality and the equity is most commonly seen and used, but this idea of equality, that everybody gets the same thing. And obviously we know that that is not helping and doesn't work. And equity, this idea of give people the resources that they need to balance it out, versus this idea of justice is how do we actually, in fact, dismantle some of those walls and systems and layers of oppression that exists in our communities. So we really, it's an essential part of our model, of our practice, and how do we engage with people who are directly impacted and get their input to change some of those things. So our mission essentially is to provide and promote these best practices and principles of peace building and global sustainability. And like Hart or Dot was saying on our brochure, that imagine, part of my vision is that every community around the world that wants a center or an organization that can help to coordinate and facilitate these peace practices, imagine the kinds of changes that we could really see. And so there's the red are those 4 different areas that I mentioned before, the social emotional learning, restorative justice, dialogues, and trauma. And the yellow are kind of the areas that we focus on and specialize in particular. And so social emotional learning, I'm sure most of you have heard that term before and participated in some of the practices, but I really believe that this is foundational for peace builders, that so many of us in our schools and in our communities have not received a lot of this kind of training and skill sets. And self-regulation in particular, responsible decision-making, right? We give a lot of our young people some medicine for that. But if we could really harness that skill set for them to come back into their reasoned thinking, and Philip used often this idea of the fight, flight, or freeze and that stress response. So what I believe is that if people are equipped to communicate more clearly and have the self-awareness of what's going on inside them, to have the patience and the consideration of what's going on in other people, and then some other skills to navigate conflict and communication, that this is fundamental for us. And so we developed originally it was a 7-week series on social emotional learning for young people on probation. And we got introduced to the Department of Juvenile Justice. They said, go ahead, you could do this as a pilot. And at the end of the series, the young people as participants, they get to choose one topic that they teach back. And so the judge was there and a lot of family members, and the judge was so impressed. He said, let's start giving this to more young people. And also we teach it in a men's prison in Florida, and we're about to launch a Train the Trainer so that these male residents will in fact facilitate it and teach it to the rest of the men in the prison. Oops, I want to go back to that. So this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Dominic Barter is English, but he lives in Brazil, and he's responsible for really introducing restorative practices. So he says, rather than being dangerous, conflict holds within it vital messages regarding unmet needs and areas of necessary change. So given this understanding, safety is increased, not by avoiding conflict, but by moving toward it with the intention of hearing the messages within. And I, like Dot was saying, I've been a mediator for well over 20 years and worked with thousands of people in conflict. And when we can kind of, I call it the underbelly of conflict, and the potentiality within conflict is so enormous to build bridges of connection, understanding, and change. And this idea of safety is increased, not by avoiding conflict, but by moving toward it. And so how do we prepare ourselves and train people to expand their capacity to hold the center, hold the space in the midst of conflict and even violence? And so we use restorative justice as one of our practices, our second pillar, which is an indigenous, it has its roots in indigenous cultures, but when there was a conflict or a crime or a harm, the community would come back together to address it. And there's 4 fundamental questions in the model that we use, which is, what happened? You get to tell your story, you get to tell your side of the story. What was the impact? Remember, we dropped that pebble in the water and you get those ripples? How did that affect you, your family, our school, our community? What might I do or we do to repair that harm and prevent it from happening in the future? And most of the time we write up an agreement, and this is generally considered a diversion. And it can be used from just minor arguments and petty theft all the way up the spectrum of harm through rape, murder, and genocide. And we did facilitate a pretty serious case on CNN of a drunken driver who hurt somebody, and she's permanently brain damaged. And they came together. She served 7 years in prison, and then after a couple more years, the family and her wanted to meet. Restorative justice is one of those practices in schools, and it's gaining a lot of momentum, but it is important that it's done well. because in many of these different strategies and practices that we use, if they're not done well, then it's so easy that there's going to be some other people that point it out and say, oh, see, it doesn't work, by one example. This is an amazing piece of data for us in Florida. It's called the Relative Rate Index. And what it points to is that you could see our county up there, called Alachua County. And so it has it for every single county in Florida. And what it's showing you, I don't know if I have a little pointer here. No. That the highest up in right there is Miami-Dade County. And they have a 9.7. And Alachua County is 9.1. So we're the second worst county in the state for what's called DMC, or disproportionate minority contact. So essentially more black and brown youth enter the criminal justice system than white people. And what you can see is that 29.5% of our youth population is African American, but they account for 81% of juvenile arrests, 81 petitions, adjudications diverted, and you can see down here, 86% have secure detention, and just 9.5% of white kids have that opportunity. So this is a really fundamental challenge of our time, and so through our work, we actually got in our police department and our sheriff department a DMC coordinator that's sole job is to drop these numbers and to look at what kind of resourcing exists, what kind of programming needs to happen, and why is this occurring. Our third pillar is trauma-informed care. I like to call it trauma-responsive care, not just being informed, but how, in fact, are we responding to it. And so how many of you have ever heard of the ACE study? Okay, wow. Yeah, I'm not going to go into it, but this is something that's really important for everybody to do a little research on. It's adverse childhood experiences. Phenomenal study about it, that each of these is a point if you've experienced this as a young person. And what we have here is kind of an overlay of, in blue, it's the Kaiser Permanente participants, and you can see how the more of those challenging experiences, they go down for the general population. However, the red are the young people in our criminal justice system, and they go up exponentially. This is really, really important information for us to see how do we resource these young people and their families to break that cycle. So that's the third area is the trauma. The last primary pillar for us are our police-youth dialogues, and that's what the breakout session, I'm gonna be talking about that. I'll show a 5-minute video, and we're gonna have a conversation about how to have dialogue with groups of people that are different from you. But this is a phenomenal and effective program of predominantly bringing African-American youth together with cops. And 95% of the young people that come to our program can't stand cops. They don't like them, they don't trust them, they don't want to be there. As a matter of fact, before I started working with them, I was like, no way do I want to work with cops. And then I was invited in and started to build rapport and friendship, have a lot of respect for these folks. And so this is a 3 to 5 hour experience of truth-telling and building some trust and having the opportunity to put each other in their shoes. We do a role play where the kids are the cops and they pull over the other folks, and they share a meal together. And so I'll be sharing more about that. But what this is doing is influencing the mindset of law enforcement. Our law enforcement agency have dropped youth arrests in schools 98% over the last 7 years. And this is really, really important and very practical of how can we influence law enforcement to consider what's driving young people's behavior and the trauma and why do they fight and flight. And how do we increase a level of trust and understanding. And this is an entry point that's challenging, but we fortunately had a chief and some other law enforcement folks that were really helpful to make that happen. And finally, my time's winding up here, but so we feel like those 4 different pillars can really make a difference if applied to an actual neighborhood. And so we've been designing a process and piloting a process over the last year to work in like a Section 8 housing. There's about 550 people that live here. And so one of our staff, who's formerly incarcerated, a woman of color, she is the director of this program of looking at how do we build rapport and trust and access to deliver some of these different strategies. And this is kind of a model of what we're using around getting core group formation. And we started with the grandmas and some of the young people, building capacity within the community, looking at who are the outside resources, who are the inside resources, how do we maximize that better, participatory governance, that they are leading the process with maybe some guidance, and network and linkaging, so kind of bringing people together. And finally, my dream, when I was in Uganda, I met a staff person. This is the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, one of the world's largest. And he was telling me that there is very little community justice. There is Sharia law, but largely it's not working. And so my dream and my passion to work with any and all of you is to translate some of the different practices that we are all using and provide it to different communities around the world. There's 65 million refugees. And imagine the potential of them having some of this skill set, as well as their own indigenous processes that can help. So our time together is to explore ways of growing peace practices, promoting social change, and ensuring future generations have the skills, knowledge, and behaviors for a lasting peace. So thank you for your partnership and for your listening.
I've worked with a lot of teenagers who have had adverse childhood experiences, who have been traumatized. My help has primarily been in the mental health area, and I wish we would have had some additional programs like Jeffrey just described, because it could have made our work more effective. Okay. So, tomorrow's program focuses on youth and the future of peace. So it's really cool that right now, the next person up, Masooma Rahmaty, is somebody who, excuse me, but I sort of look at you and see a young woman still maybe in the youth category. You probably know Jeffrey, that kind of goes up to age 26 sometimes. We don't have to know how old you are. So, youth and the future of peace, but Masooma is active now in the present moment. So it's already happening. I'll read you a quick little bio. Masooma is a program officer at the International Peace Institute, where she focuses on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and also women, peace, and society. She is a United Nations NGO youth representative and also an associate board member of River Tides, a nonprofit. Previously, Ms. Rahmaty worked at the Permanent Mission of Afghanistan to the UN, as well as various other UN organizations. Masooma?
Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you also for the organizers to have invited me here. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah, you should be able to hear me, yeah? Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, sorry about that. So I was just saying thank you for the organizers for having me here today, and also providing me the space to actually stay here and experience the Mohonk Mountain stay here with the amazing view. So thank you so much for that. So the problem with, being the last speaker is the responsibility would be on me to impress you, and there's nothing I could say to impress you. But also, the reason I also didn't go to podium is to save time. As Brad mentioned, I work for the International Peace Institute, IPI. It's a research think tank based in New York City. It's right across the United Nations. So we have different programs focusing on women, peace and security, development, peace and security in general, humanitarian affairs. So our main focus is to do research and follow policies, especially the policies that are adopted by the United Nations and the resolution, and to track their progress. The team that I'm working at IPI is heavily focusing on the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and that's the topic that I'll be talking about today. So as you all may know, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, were adopted in 2015. The SDGs are essentially a to-do list for all the countries that governments agreed to achieve them by the year 2030. There's more or less 4,000 days left to achieve all the SDGs. That is, if you count weekends and holidays. But we all know no one is going to work on the weekend or the holidays. So that leaves us with only more than 2,000 days to achieve the SDGs. So here we go. The time is running out. Can we do this? So before going there, I just wanted to give you an overview of where we are with the SDGs and where are the governments. So at the United Nations, there's a review mechanism for tracking the SDGs. It's primarily for the government. So every July, during the forum called High-Level Political Forum, governments, member states, they come and present their report on the SDGs. The report is called Voluntary National Review. As its name says, it's voluntarily. It's not mandatory for every member state to come and talk about their progress on the SDGs. So every year, they don't review all the 17 SDGs. They only review a few selected of them that's already pre-selected by the United Nations and the resolutions. So for example, this year, the goals that were focused on was SDG 4 on education, which Dr. Yakubi spoke about it heavily today in her presentation, SDG 8 on economic growth, SDG 10 on equality, SDG 13 on climate change, SDG 16, peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. SDG 17, which is on partnership, that gets reviewed every single year. So this year particularly was very important for the SDGs. You ask why? There are multiple reasons. So the first reason is because the first cycle review of the SDGs ended this year. That means 4 years passed since the SDGs were adopted. And during these 4 years, all the 17 SDGs were reviewed. So the UN held a big SDG summit in September of this year with heads of states, prime minister, presidents, all coming to discuss the challenges and opportunities for the implementation of these goals. The second reason is because the most controversial goals were discussed this year during the high-level political forum. And these goals are SDG 10 on inequality, SDG 13 on climate change, SDG 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. We call these goals, these targets, the misfits, goals that are often viewed as not related to development, which is completely wrong because, I would say, because given today's presentation, we all know that they're very much interlinked to each other. And the last reason that this year was important is because of the ongoing UN reform at the United Nations. When Secretary General Guterres became the Secretary General, he came up with a number of reforms that focused on peace and security, the management, and as well as UN development system. So that's a topic that I'm not going to even open up the Pandora box. We can discuss that some other time. So for those of you who like numbers, I just want to give you a brief statistics on how many countries presented their progress report. So far, since 2016, 149 countries presented their progress report or VNR, Voluntary National Reviews. 7 countries presented their VNRs twice, or progress report. And this is possible. Every country, every government can present their progress report twice or 3 times, or every year if they want to. And around 53 countries haven't presented their progress report, and that includes the United States, Russia, Iran, among others. So that's an overview of the discussions and a general presentation of what's being discussed about the SDGs at the UN. But what is really going on the ground? So not many people, unfortunately, know about the SDGs. I mean, I know a few of you here know, and it is because of a few individuals who are interested in the work of the United Nations and the SDGs. But outside of New York, I live in Queens. If I ask someone, what is the SDGs, they're not going to know what it is, and it's not surprising. So that's one of the biggest issues that we currently have. I mean, some agree that the SDGs are more comprehensive in comparison to its predecessor, Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. But the discussion around the goals still remain at the high level, and it hasn't trickled down to the communities that really need them the most. So leaving no one behind, I'm sure you have heard about this a million times, is at the core of the 2030 agenda. And if the discussion around these goals remain at the halls of the United Nations, it will not have any impact on people's life, especially those who are most vulnerable and live under harsh circumstances, such as countries who are affected by conflict. The conversation has to move away from the UN conference halls, and this is something that the UN can't possibly do by itself, and this is why I'm here. So what is the way forward? So localization of the SDGs on the ground is key, and I can't stress this enough. And the research that we are doing every day shows exactly this, that SDGs has to be localized in different communities. It has to go beyond the headquarters. It has to go beyond the government. The SDGs may be a new language, but it's not a new concept. Tackling poverty, quality education, access to health, employment, and wanting to live in a peaceful society has always been the topic of discussion. And people have been working on these issues for decades. And you see them all sitting right next to me, and also yourself included. So who doesn't want them? What the SDGs provide is basically a policy guidance for the governments, and as well as international partners, civil societies, community-based organizations to tackle these issues that's often the root causes of major conflict, unfortunately, around the world. What is needed to get there? Last week, actually on Thursday, I just came back from Gambia. Gambia is a small country with more than 1 million people in a sub-region of West Africa. It's right in between Senegal, if you look at the map. And we organized a forum called the 2030 Agenda, building on what works, bringing people from 8 different countries from the sub-region, countries like Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Ghana, and a number of others. The reason we chose the title Building on What Works is that we strongly believe the communities themselves have the solution to their problems. They know their needs, and they have the tools, and they can guide every partner or an international partner who is willing to work with them. And the only issue is that we have to listen to them, and we have to take note of what they know and how we can contribute to them. This is why we chose Building on What Works. So we created a workshop for each of these countries and put them together. From every country, we chose a government representative, 2 civil society, and a local authority, mayor or a chieftain or someone from a district level. So often at the United Nations, if you're working there, you see that you don't see a diverse group of people there. You often see the government alone. And civil society has very little space to contribute to anything. But we wanted to break that and wanted to create an environment that everyone can participate. This is why we created this specific workshop for all these groups to come together and actually talk and share their solutions and challenges. So when we gathered these groups together, we asked them to tell us a story about a work that they did that has been successful in their communities. Doesn't matter from Sierra Leone, Gambia, Senegal, whatever the country. Just tell us a story that was successful and tell us what made that project or that story successful. Which kind of ingredients did it have that helped to make it successful? And these were the followings that they came up with, regardless of which context or which country they shared this with us. These are the common themes that came out throughout the discussion. First, community ownership and community leadership. Consultations with local communities and engaging with them directly is key to whether you're working on development or peace. The second one is partnership, working together with all stakeholders, including the government, international partners, private sector, NGOs, and everyone. We have to stop thinking that we can't do this by ourselves. Governments need to stop thinking that, oh, they can do this. They have the power. This is not right. It's not working. It hasn't been working. And this is why we have to think creatively on how we can work together to drive both, whether that's development or peace or the 2030 agenda. The other one is political will from all actors to actually walk the talk and not just talk, because we have had it enough. Inclusion of all individuals in the process, including youth, women, religious, and traditional leaders in the communities. So I know I spoke too much, but I just wanted to conclude by saying that, and this was something that we also spoke about at the dinner last night, an integrated approach. If we are to have a truly sustainable development and peace everywhere, then we can't separate SDGs from one another. At the UN, we use the phrase breaking silos, and that is to say that we need to stop thinking that health is separate from education, and that economic growth is not related to poverty or inequality. And we definitely need to stop sidelining women's role in peace and development, who are half of the world's population. So I was asked here today to provide a solution, a practical solution for peace and development. And I'm going to ask you to reevaluate the 2030 agenda and see, do you think that the 2030 agenda can be a good solution for the humanity to save our world? And this all depends on us, on me, on you, and the rest of the people who are outside or the people who are watching online. Thank you.
Thank you, Masooma. And Jeffrey and Solange, as we prepare to open up for comments and questions for a few minutes, I want to say that maybe you might address this just briefly, but your sense, as you're speaking of no silos and really no separation, it's a thread that we just heard throughout all three sharings. People telling their stories, having the opportunity to be a voice in the room, talking about challenges, but also the move-through points, the solutions. And each one of you talking about dialogue, connection, deep listening, and it using by whatever language, and then partnership and how critical that is, relationship, partnership, to actually grounding all of this. So it's like a weave with some key points. I wonder if you might wish to comment or have a brief conversation yourselves, because the theme, regardless of the solutions that we're hearing, there are certain threads that we're understanding are shared values that run through those solutions.
Let's see. Hello. Which one is working? This one.
That one works.
What comes to my mind about that, Dot, is the experience of trust. And there's a great book called The Speed of Trust, which I tell everybody to read. And what we've seen in our community is that there is a lack of trust on a lot of different levels. And yet, at the same time, so many of our community members, once that trust is established, deeply appreciate additional support and resources. And so what are those practices of building trust? One of them is acknowledging and naming people's experience, validating people's experience, and that if they feel that they are being understood and respected and valued, that is one of those ways to open some doors of having conversation. And that it doesn't happen often in one conversation. It does take some consistency and efforts.
I think what was remarkable about working in the 80s in the refugee camps is that it was a partnership formed between people from many countries, internationalists, with the displaced people, and living together and dialogue and listening and coming up with solutions to address their physical needs in the camps. But also in that process, we formed a community of people from Germany, France, the United States, Honduran doctors. It was really a remarkable social experiment that has endured to this day in the communities. And also in the early 90s, the sanctuary movement and the partnerships of communities in the United States with communities in El Salvador. And those partnerships have endured because of that shared experience of building peace together.
When it comes to partnership, I think something that, or maybe because I'm coming from this UN community right now, maybe I'm trying to step away from my bubble. In partnership, there's a risk, and there's a fear. There's a fear among partners, and you can't. Like a lot of government agencies, United Nations and civil society, when they work together, it's very difficult to navigate that. It's very difficult to be confident and be true to what you want to achieve, And I know this sounds like a bit cliche, but you can't. I constantly see this in any projects where the government is involved, the United Nations is involved, and civil society is involved. Because often, United Nations is basically a member state-based organization, and it's basically government, and the government, of course, having the driving seat in every aspect, can, create an environment that not allow, for a safe space for civil society engagement. And I think this is what we have to admit. Every partner, especially government, have to, be open to that, be open to criticism, because criticism, it helps you, develop, it helps you become better. And I think this is something that I would want to see in any projects where government, UN, or civil society is involved with.
Yeah, thank you. And creating safe space for engagement, that's critical. We know that through the center, and I hear that through your work as well, Solange. Thank you, Masooma. So let's open it up for comments, questions from any of you. Here's right here, Brad. And if you will say your name, tell us your name before you speak.
My name is Jill Olesker, and I mostly work with young children, which is what drew me to here, to see what carries over. And you just said something that I thought was really intriguing, which was the role of reflection and of being able to create a safe space for everyone in the community, including if you work with young children, to reflect on what's happening. And I just wondered if any of you would sort of speak a little more to that role of reflecting.
So creating a safe space, this is, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. This is, again, had the advantage of working in a nonprofit has taught me a lot. And especially that my organization is right across the UN. And when I go to the UN, you know, everyone, a diplomat, ambassadors, all the politicians basically, they read a statement. They read a statement and they say exactly what their capital back home told them to. And it's rare to see where diplomats or policymakers, they feel comfortable to share more than that, you know, because they don't want to. And that's completely, you know, their right not to do and not to risk anything. But on the other hand, when we invite them in a safe space, sometimes we provide that at International Peace Institute. And we also told them, you're not recorded, you're not, you know, there's no camera or anything to record what you're saying. That's where they open up. That's where they share the true, you know, their true personal opinion about a policy or about, you know, something that they're working on. So I think it's really key, whether you're working in a community, whether you're working at the UN, whether you're working in a government, you have to have that space to feel comfortable and share your experience of what you're doing and what are actually the challenges on the way of achieving that you need to achieve.
I did have a couple thoughts, but I'll be totally straight with you. I hate getting feedback. You know, there's an exposure that happens, and yet obviously it's essential, and true leadership has that openness and vulnerability to get feedback. But you know, I don't like it. However, I do want to say and make a link around restorative practices and self-reflection. First off, it's an emotional intelligence skill set to have self-reflection. Super important. It's built into the process of restorative justice of what were you thinking, what were you feeling at the time, what was the impact on you, you know, what happened. So it's such a powerful way of, in fact, holding people accountable and working towards addressing the harm that may have occurred. And so that in as non-judgmental a way as possible. Yes, you may go to jail. Yes, you may have to pay this. Yes, there are certain consequences and sanctions. And yet in that conversation, there's a humanizing process that goes, wow, I had no idea that's what you were thinking or that's why you did what you did. So super important and deeply linked in the restorative practices.
One of the aspects of the refugee camps was small group work and a lot of self-reflection because they were living in a very difficult environment where the military could come in at any time. So they were constantly on alert, but a lot of meetings, the community leaders at all the little levels of the camps, the colonias as they were called. So it was really a process that they engaged in. And I believe that that came from the Christian-based communities that were so strong in Central America, where the nuns and the priests who lived in the communities reflected upon their reality and related that to the readings of Scripture. And it was that practice that empowered them to share their reality and reflect upon it. And that process still continues in their meetings with voices. When we go down there, there's so much self-reflection, and we'll sit for 2-3 hours with the community members talking in that way. But it's really, it goes back to the Christian-based communities and the movement of the sacred activists, the priests and the nuns.
We have time for one more quick question and one quick response, please.
Hi, my name is Dear Williams. I'm with the Rondout Valley Human Rights Club. And I had a question for Mr. Weisberg. I found your presentation really interesting, and I related to the idea of repairing the relationship between law enforcement and community. It's not really a problem where I am right now, but the school district I moved from and the community I moved from, it was a problem, and it is a growing problem. And I did want to do something about it. I had similar ideas to what you were doing, and I had an adult tell me things would never change. So I was just wondering what you would say to an adult that thinks things would never change, and what were the first actions you took if the problem is severe and the separation is borderline? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Golly gee. Well, you know, one of the things I'm actually so proud of is standing in the face of my fear and the resistance of law enforcement and doing it anyways, and doing it being my work. And what the feedback that I've gotten from the leadership of these two law enforcement agencies is that you and your organization and this work has changed my mind and changed my thinking. And that, I could die pretty happy with that, you know. And so part of it, I think, is to just keep trying. It's about relationship building, you know, that if you can get a door opening and somebody who's willing to engage in some different practices, dialogue or other things, and demonstrate it. Because this, I don't want to use a cuss word, this works. This stuff works, you know? And when people can actually have a new experience of connecting or moving through resistance and changing, then you'll get, this is what Philip was talking about, then there becomes this alignment with other energies that can support your work. So hopefully you can come to my session later. I can give you some more coaching and some ideas where you could just really just experiment and practice with it. But thank you so much.
Okay, so we're ready to shift gears. A few reminders.
We are, but we have to take our 30 seconds, and then over to you. So let's digest this for 30 seconds, take this in, anchor these energies, and distribute. And thank you for that question. And my New Jersey self would say, watch us. So let's take 30 seconds.
It's really cool how when we all take 30 seconds, we can do it in our own way, but yet we're doing it all together.
And a thank you to our panelists.
Yeah. So the breakout schedule? Okay, so remember to turn your clocks back tonight, folks. Daylight saving times ends at 2 a.m. later tonight. And please don't forget that Sue DeSico is still up in the rock reading room doing the peace cranes. You can visit her there. So here is what's happening with the breakout rooms. Right here in this very parlor, currently my favorite sacred space, Jeffrey will stay here and talk about community initiatives. And since we're set up with the live streaming, that will be live streamed. In the Mountain View room, which is just right out here, just slightly to the right, Philip will have a breakout entitled Finding Common Ground. And Solange will be in the Laurel Lounge that's downstairs. It's the side room of the Lake Lounge where we just had lunch. You can go right into that same room where we had lunch, and it's just a room on the side to the right as you walk in. Sakina Yacobi will be in the Sunset Lounge, also just right out here. And Masooma will be in Suite 130, which again is just right out here.
So, Brad, we need one sentence from each of the breakouts. Philip, can you just stand and give us a sentence? What will people be coming to experience?
We will be doing practical exercises to bring out the principles of polarization and then how to bridge and finding common ground, things that you can immediately apply in your life.
Excellent. Solange, what will one sentence?
One sentence will be really focusing on sacred activism and the Quaker way.
And we'll be looking at how dialogue is used with youth and police and youth and teachers, and looking at designing your own dialogue process.
And in my team, we will have an interactive conversation on how to connect the 2030 agenda to peace.
Sakina will be speaking and interacting with you about empowering women and youth. And then about an hour from now, if you are interested, we can reconvene back here for an informal tea with the speakers and board members. And that will end it for today after the tea here. We do have an announcement coming up from Ms. Graham. Nancy is our administrative coordinator.
Who made all things happen.
She has done a ton of work the last few months, especially in the last week, and she has been able to maintain her sanity. Thank you.
I'm not really sane. But each of these sessions will be attended by a Mohonk Consultations representative who will be doing what?
They will be doing support for you folks. The presenters will do their own facilitation, and our folks will be there just to help out. There'll be a little sign in front of each room. Okay, and Ms. Smiley wants to say something?
Anyone wants to take a walk?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. The weather is perfect. The sun is still up. And Nina will meet with you just right outside. And you can do a walk in nature mindfully with Nina Smiley.
Yeah, and we're going to be meeting at the bottom of the central stairs. So you just go out the store, down one flight, and then I'll meet you right down there. It's a silent walk, and it will probably be, for those of us who are a little sensitive to the weather, probably about half an hour. And it's experiencing mindfulness in nature moment to moment.
Dr. Zakubi had a change of travel, so she will not be doing a breakout session. She has to leave for Saudi Arabia, where she is spending 5 days in a conference on education and technology. So she's very sorry that this has happened. And so those of you who wanted to go there, find another wonderful breakout session.
Thank you, Lorraine. And then we will see you back here for a cup of tea and reflection informally around 5 o'clock.
Yes.